With NFL free agency coming up, which Denver Broncos unrestricted free agents fit Vance Joseph's scheme and what he wants to do? Are there any Arizona Cardinals free agents that could follow him over to Denver? You get that and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome into a brand new episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. Every single day, you can get this podcast free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format, or you can watch us on YouTube as well. Do us a favor, hit that subscribe or that follow button down below so you never miss out on a day's worth of Broncos news, content coverage, and more. Which Broncos free agents could fit with Vance Joseph's defense? Which potential Arizona Cardinals free agents could come over and follow Vance Joseph? What does the defensive staff look like? We'll break all that down on today's episode of Locked On Broncos. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantlyorange.com. Sayre, a multitude of things we have to ask ourselves here. Obviously, the news last week, Vance Joseph, the defensive coordinator of the Denver Broncos, coming back. We broke everything down. If you missed that episode, Locked On Broncos, you can go back on your favorite podcast provider or YouTube and watch it. But now we got to take a look at the Broncos' unrestricted free agents, restricted free agents as well, that are set to hit the market or have a team option March 15th. Do any of these guys fit Vance Joseph's scheme that maybe makes them coming back a little more likely? It's a very, very interesting question to ask.
It is, Cody, and certainly when we talked about Vance Joseph returning in the capacity of defensive coordinator, I think, just reading through the comments, responding to a few of those, it seems like a pretty polarizing subject for everybody, as you would expect, right? The Vance Joseph era, not exactly fondly remembered by anyone in Broncos country, and so therefore Vance Joseph not overly fondly remembered by many Broncos fans. But hey, the last 4 years, he's had a chance to kind of reset things the way that he does things. And quite frankly, in Arizona, they really built the defense around what Vance wanted to do, right? He was there for 4 seasons, so that's a full life cycle of a draft class. So when he came in, they invested pretty heavily on that defensive side of the ball. And it just so happens that now that he's moved on from the Cardinals, so too will that initial draft class, right? That 2019 NFL draft class now potentially all moving on, except for Kyler Murray, obviously, who's locked into a long-term deal there. But defensively, some of the cornerstone picks that they made in that draft, we'll talk about those coming up today. But first and foremost, that Denver Broncos 2019 NFL draft class, Cody, somebody the Cardinals did not take in that group. I think the number one free agent, when you say, does he fit Vance Joseph's scheme? Does he fit what Vance wants to do? I think if somebody like Dre'Mont Jones, Cody, if he doesn't fit your scheme, you might want to rethink the way that you do call a defense, maybe scheme a defense, right? Dre'Mont Jones seems to be pretty scheme versatile to me. I would certainly say, at first and foremost, does Dre'Mont Jones fit Vance Joseph's defense? That may not be the right question. It's like, if he doesn't fit your defense, what are you doing?
I think that's a great thing to throw out there, right? And I think when you look at the scheme, right, it's going to be 3-4, so it's nothing that Dre'Mont hasn't played in. I mean, we've seen he can play on the outside of defensive end, kind of wide split in a 5-tech if you need to. He can also play on the defensive interior. They did a lot of mixing and matching with that. It would be wild to think that Dre'Mont doesn't fit Vance's scheme, and I hope that Vance is like, hey, I would really benefit from having a guy like Dre'Mont on the roster, and we'll see how things pan out with March 15th coming up. Denver's going to have a lot of things in between now and then that maybe they could do to either extend him. They'll place the franchise tag on him before March 7th. We'll see how it all pans out. I wanted to ask you about Kareem Jackson, though. Does he seem like a fit for VJ's defense? And I feel like a lot of this, VJ will have say over some of his defensive personnel, but I think ultimately everything is going to filter through Sean Payton. So the question I think we have to ask here, Kareem Jackson, as good as he's been for Denver, is this the year they move on? Because the last 2 years he signed a 1-year deal after becoming an unrestricted free agent to come back to Denver. Is that on the table considering he wants to play another 1 to 2 years?
I kind of do feel like it's time to move on for everybody. Not that Kareem is a bad player or bad fit for the locker room by any means, or maybe not even a bad fit for Vance Joseph's defense, right? But I kind of feel like the Broncos may need to get a little younger at that position, maybe go for somebody who offers a bit more upside in terms of what is this team, what did we see that was so exciting down the stretch last season? They were creating a lot of turnovers. And with Caden Stearns in the lineup, remember, he's picked off, 4 passes in 2 years, even though he's really played kind of a minimal role in the defense. I would love to see not just that the Broncos thrust Caden Stearns into the starting role because his injury and recovery last season, that's going to be a factor here. But I wouldn't mind seeing, hey, is there somebody that Vance coached, when he was in Miami, or is there somebody else that he coached in Arizona that could come in and play some safety? Or maybe you just identify somebody else. If the pro scouting department gets with Vance and they do some looking at this year's free agent safety class, which has some really good players in it, I would not mind seeing the Broncos do a little something different there to get somebody who offers a bit more upside in terms of causing those turnovers, playing in coverage a little bit more. That would be nice to see, right? And I think Kareem Jackson deserves the opportunity to go out and continue to play in whatever, there's plenty of coaches out there that he's worked with in recent years, Cody, that I think will want to have him as part of their defense. But to me, I would say maybe the time now is when the Broncos move on.
And we'll see what they do. I mean, I feel like a lot of what I've been looking at is who's going to play that Budda Baker role, right? That we saw, him excel in Arizona. I'm eager to see what that is. Another guy, Alex Singleton, we know is set to become a top priority free agent for the Broncos. I mean, do you think he fits in what Vance and what Sean Payton ultimately wants to do?
I'm interested by this, right? I don't know exactly where things are with, Vic Fangio and his scheme. He came in, obviously Josie Jewell developed really well under Vic and then played extremely well for Ejiro Evero, which Alex Singleton also, right? And so you kind of wonder now that it's Vance Joseph and things are kind of changing significantly back, over there in terms of, I mean, it's not like he's a disciple of Vic Fangio, right? I mean, Vance Joseph, he comes from a different coaching tree, but man, I mean, you can't help but wonder now, does Alex Singleton go play for Ejiro Evero? Does Vic Fangio try to make a move for Josie Jewell? What does that mean for the Broncos linebacker personnel? I'm interested to see. Like, I felt like it's kind of a no-brainer bringing Alex Singleton back, and I still would say on paper that makes a lot of sense. However, there are a lot of off-ball linebackers in this free agent class, Cody. We saw how heavily the Arizona Cardinals emphasized that position these last handful of years under Vance Joseph, right? I mean, they used a top 10 pick on Isaiah Simmons out of Clemson. They used another first-round pick on Zaven Collins. And you just kind of look at that and you say, okay, what does that mean for what the Broncos are going to do now with Vance in that spot? I'd be interested to see what does he think about. I mean, I know Josie was drafted when Vance was still the head coach, so it's going to be fascinating to see. But that's a big name free agent right there, Alex Singleton, and I think you kind of look at him and Josie Jewell as a pair, right? And I don't know, maybe that's not how you see it. I kind of feel like if you let Alex Singleton walk, does that mean you also let Josie Jewell go in a trade or something else?
Yeah, that's a scary thing to ponder because, right, I mean, you do have Jonas Griffith, who we have a lot of excitement about. You have Justin Sternad, but behind that, Denver has no other inside linebackers. So you have to consider that, especially with other needs pertaining on the offensive line. How can you address all these potential things in free agency is a great question here. And I think that when you factor in Sean Payton and Vance Joseph now, like, it could change everything. Like, we view it on paper, as you mentioned, as this makes sense, but it could make entirely different sense to them to where we're like, whoa, we did not see this coming. That is, I think, an intriguing option about this offseason. I'm waiting and excited and a little nervous to see how it all plays out. But one thing is for certain, we'll find out here sooner rather than later what the Broncos' plans are with some of the personnel now with Vance Joseph coming over. But another question that we want to ask on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, are there any Arizona Cardinals free agents that the Broncos could look at? And especially on the defensive side of the ball, is there anybody who could follow Vance to Denver this offseason? You'll get that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. And the midway point of the NBA season is here and the playoffs are approaching. And now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scorers to three-pointers drained in a game. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss the chance to go get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/LockedOn. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Which potential free agents could follow Vance Joseph to Denver on the defensive side of the ball? And are there any offensive options the Broncos could take a look at? Thank you so much, Broncos Country, for tuning in and making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. We appreciate you so much taking time out of your day to listen or to watch us break down all things Denver Broncos related here every single day, all year long. Continuing on with our conversation on today's episode of the show, Sayre, we just talked about which defensive players for the Broncos that are set to become free agents maybe fit Vance Joseph's scheme. Another angle we can look at here is which potential free agents from the Arizona Cardinals defensively could follow Vance Joseph potentially to Denver. And then there's also some other offensive options that we could look at as well. But I think an intriguing thing to look at, we talked about Dre'Mont Jones. If for some reason the Broncos decide to let Dre'Mont Jones walk, maybe they could take a look at Zach Allen, defensive end for the Cardinals, who's also set to become a free agent this year.
Definitely could, Cody. I mean, just like Dre'Mont Jones with the Denver Broncos the last couple of years, Zach Allen has really emerged for the Arizona Cardinals as a viable threat, on that defensive line. And that's getting after the quarterback, creating havoc in the run game, doing all sorts of things. And remember, I mentioned at the beginning of the show that 2019 NFL draft class, the first class that came in when Vance became the defensive coordinator of the Arizona Cardinals, Zach Allen was part of that. He was the top pick of round 3 in that draft. And so Vance has overseen his development from day one. And I think there is value to that when you talk about free agency and familiarity with scheme and things like that. So let's just go with a hypothetical here, because that's what I love to do this time of year. What if Dre'Mont Jones is asking for $18-20 million a year and Zach Allen's market is closer to the $14-15 million a year? Do you look at that as, hey, that gap is big enough, those savings are big enough that we're willing to go with the guy who's familiar with Vance Joseph as opposed to Dre'Mont Jones? Or if the price is right on both guys, let's say both guys are asking for, $14 to $16 million a year. Do you make that investment and go cheaper on the offensive line? I'm not saying that they should do that. I know a lot of people are going to get crazy here. I'm talking hypotheticals, but an interesting scenario nonetheless, given the fact that the Broncos defensive line, it kind of needs a bit of revamping this offseason.
Well, he missed the final 4 games of last year for the Cardinals, but here's an interesting stat, right? He had 5.5 sacks last year, but he also had 20 quarterback hits, 20 QB hits in just 13 games. That's impressive, and that's kind of like the dynamic. Like if let's say Dre'Mont's price, according to the Broncos, is too high, what is a guy like Zach Allen's? I mean, he had one less sack than Dre'Mont last year, but he had more quarterback hits. These are interesting things I'm playing out in my head right now. So, I mean, I'm eager for Broncos Country's thoughts on that. If they're watching or listening, make sure you tweet or you comment on the YouTube video. Another name to watch, Byron Murphy, cornerback, right? And I think that if the Broncos, for some reason, you and I talked about this last week, salary cap cuts could be incoming at any point ahead of free agency. If the Broncos decided to do that with Ronald Darby, Byron Murphy is also another name that could follow VJ to Denver and add them with, a highly athletic cornerback that I think gives them some versatility. I mean, you talk about body type, physique, athleticism. I mean, he kind of fits the mold. He looks a little bit like Patrick Surtain from a body and physique standpoint, and he's fast. He can jump really high, and he's got a tenacity to make plays whenever the football's thrown his way. I wouldn't be opposed to that either.
I wouldn't either, Cody, at all. And I'm just looking at a couple of contracts here for the Broncos. They could save over $2 million if they also let go of K'Wan Williams. I feel like if you let go of Ronald Darby and K'Wan Williams, maybe a bit of overkill there, but that could save you almost $12 million on the salary cap. And say you do bring in Byron Murphy, could probably get him for a cap hit, less than half of that this coming season. So you have the savings there, and then you would have a top three at the cornerback position of Surtain, Damari Mathis, and Byron Murphy, who's already proven dating back to his time at Washington. I remember loving watching him coming out in that 2019 draft. He can play the nickel, and he's played some at the NFL level as well. So he can play inside, he can play outside. I don't think signing him would prevent you from moving forward with developing Damari Mathis, which could be an absolutely huge deal for the Broncos. And I love, this is my personal brand in free agency, Cody, signing the younger players. I don't love signing guys who are close to 30, who are over 30, unless it's obviously at the quarterback position or maybe offensive line, but I like that thinking. I like that way of operating. Cornerback is such an important position. You can never have too many good players there. He had 4 interceptions in 2021. Cody took a little bit of a step back in 2022, of course, health-wise, which was an issue for a lot of players on the Cardinals defense. So I'm very much a fan of this idea. I don't know what he's going to cost price-wise. Can't imagine he's going to be up there in the $20 million per year range coming off a year where he only played 9 games, but you never know in the craziness of free agency. And speaking of, I know Vance didn't coach special teams or offense in Arizona, but the Broncos could have an opening at the kicker position relatively soon. And who's been kicking really well for the Arizona Cardinals in recent years is our old pal Matt Prater, who I'm sure wouldn't mind kicking at altitude once again.
I think another question you have to ask there, because I also remember he was dealing with injuries. I mean, they had situations where he missed some games last year. Would it make sense for the Broncos at this point? Is what you're getting from Matt Prater going to be better than what you're getting from Brandon McManus? I think it's intriguing to look at, especially if they do decide to cut or move on from McManus. Why not bring in Matt Prater and see what you have? I mean, he's one of the best kickers in the NFL. He's one of the record holders in the NFL. I mean, before Justin Tucker broke it on that, was a 67-yarder in Detroit. Yeah. That was a wild situation, by the way. I'm not opposed to that. And also quickly, while we're talking about the Arizona Cardinals and maybe the offensive side of the ball where VJ didn't coach, I mean, they have some intriguing free agent options on the offensive line side of things that could plug in at center, could plug in at left guard, or even tackle.
That's right. Rodney Hudson, Justin Pugh, you got Will Hernandez, Kelvin Beachum. I mean, a lot of free agents on the offensive line coming from Arizona. I know a lot of Broncos fans really loved Will Hernandez coming out of that 2018 NFL draft class when he was picked by the Giants originally and then obviously made his way to Arizona. I definitely wouldn't mind any of those guys coming in. And like I said, you allocate free agent resources to other positions. Like Vance didn't coach those guys specifically, but I guarantee you he knows them well. So that is a connection worth mentioning, even though he wasn't with them every single day in their meeting rooms and things like that. I guarantee you he knows those guys extremely well. So that's something to watch for, because it's not just the defensive side that he is connected to from Arizona. He's going to know those players. He knows their strengths. He knows he went up against them in practice every day. So he knows them well. And I think there is value to that when you look at the Broncos. Maybe you do go a little budget friendly at certain spots. Not to say they shouldn't throw assets at the offensive line. I think they should, but it might be worth the squeeze to say, hey, we really liked Will Hernandez coming out of the 2018 draft. Didn't get a chance to draft him specifically, but maybe he could be a good 1-year flyer at that left guard spot. So just thinking through those different things, or like you mentioned, Justin Pugh and Rodney Hudson, guys who are long-term, starters in the NFL. Maybe you do try to find a solution there with one of those guys. But at any rate, it's going to be fascinating to see if any of these connections do play out in free agency for the Broncos. I think we'll see at least 1 or 2 connected players to Vance Joseph come to the Broncos, not back to the Broncos, come to the Broncos with him.
We'll see, Broncos country, we're eager for your thoughts. If you could choose between any of the Arizona Cardinals pending free agents on the defensive side of the ball or the offensive side of the ball, who intrigues you the most. Let us know in the YouTube comment section down below or tweet us on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. On today's episode, Locked On Broncos, we're going to continue the conversation. The Broncos defensive side of the ball with Vance Joseph as the defensive coordinator. His staff is starting to fill out. We're going to talk about those coaches and what they bring to the table on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. But I wanted to tell you real quick about what we have going on here at the Locked On Podcast Network. If you love Colorado sports, we have a Locked On podcast for you. If you love the basketball team that's not in Colorado, we have the Locked On NBA Network that has a wide variety of NBA teams with local hosts on the biggest stories, especially as the playoffs are coming up right now. So make sure you check out the Locked On NBA Network and find your favorite Locked On NBA basketball team here on the Locked On Podcast Network. With Vance Joseph as the defensive coordinator, his defensive staff is now filling out under head coach Sean Payton. Some familiar names returning that we're excited about, and some new names that will be coaching some important positions this upcoming season. Thank you so much for tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. We appreciate you so much, everybody in Broncos country. Sayre, we already highlighted how excited we were that Christian Parker and Marcus Dixon were returning on staff this year for the Broncos. Parker coaching defensive backs, Dixon coaching defensive line. Since then, since that episode dropped last Thursday, the Broncos have made some other coaching hires on the defensive side of the ball as well. Inside linebacker coach Greg Manuski's coming over from the Minnesota Vikings, a longtime coach in the NFL, former defensive coordinator experience. And now he's going to be working with inside linebackers. And I think the biggest question I have for you and I have for Broncos country and their thoughts on it is, what is the biggest need for linebacker play from Denver this upcoming season?
That's a great question, because we saw them really overachieve based on expectations in 2022. So in 2023, I suppose it would be maybe not necessarily overachieving, but keeping that level of play high. I mean, Josie Jewell and Alex Singleton, they played fast, they played aggressive, they played smart, they were all over the field. You know, they were good against the run, they were effective against the pass, they stayed on the field when they needed to for all three downs. I mean, that's what you want to see more of going forward. So that's what you want to see from the linebackers this coming season. I think one of the biggest coaching hires that they made, Cody, is bringing in Michael Wilhoit to coach the offense, or the outside linebackers, excuse me. What he has at that position right now is not exactly a blank canvas. A lot of big name guys are, big money acquisition. Randy Gregory, second round draft pick, Nick Bonito. You got obviously Baron Browning, who showed a ton of promise, and then a bunch of other guys there. Talent development at that position is going to be absolutely crucial. I know that Michael Wilhoit was a tremendous special teams player as an NFL player just a few years back. I mean, he hasn't been in the coaching ranks too long, but obviously he's worked with Sean Payton before. Now he's going to be coaching those outside backers in Denver. That's going to be a fascinating situation to watch develop as well, because while there could be turnover at inside linebacker, there's a lot of guys at outside linebacker that you and I both probably would agree to say tons of talent, but they need to take the next step, especially after the Bradley Chubb trade last season.
That, I think, to me, is the biggest question I have with outside linebacker is, how can you get after the quarterback even more? And we've talked about, like, Vance Joseph's scheme, we believe, will open things up, because our more recent example with Vance here in Denver was Von Miller and Bradley Chubb combining for 26.5 sacks that year before, obviously, he got fired. And for Denver, there's so many questions, right? Like, can Randy Gregory stay healthy? I think if Randy can stay healthy, he is going to be a force for the Broncos. He's going to be somebody that is going to absolutely wreak havoc against opposing offensive tackles. We already saw the size, the power, and the speed that he possesses. We saw it before he got injured. And now you're getting a whole entire offseason to get healthy. You're going to be able to go into training camp now fully healthy, 100%, which for Randy Gregory to really not really participate much in training camp last year, to come straight into week one of the regular season and do what he did, that tells me that he's got a lot of talent to him that I think Vance Joseph can utilize and maximize. And obviously with Michael Wilhoit as the outside linebacker coach, can find ways to get him going. Now, I think the other question is can Baron Browning continue to evolve into an elite pass rusher? We see that he has the speed, the athleticism that we saw from guys like Hassan Reddick, which are being very, it's important now. It's popular. Like the Micah Parsons of the world. Everyone's like, oh yeah, the next Micah Parsons. I feel like we're just seeing that change with how NFL offenses have evolved and how you're taking guys who have extremely high athletic traits and you're like, you know what? While having those guys in space is a good thing, what if we just put them on the outside where they can maybe take advantage of a slower offensive tackle? We're seeing that transition in the NFL now. Can Baron Browning become an elite starter at edge rusher? I think his development this upcoming season is going to be important, and more importantly, you and I are also hoping, please don't move him to inside linebacker. Keep him at edge rusher. I think that's where he benefits the team the most going forward.
Yeah, they have to keep him there. I mean, he definitely showed last year that he is a big-time potential, game wrecker off the edge. I think if you get him to play consistently well off the edge and really hone in on those pass rush moves and be just a little bit more consistent, right? That's what you need to see from young players as they grow. Just find that consistency. I think in year 3, Baron Browning can take that next step, and then we'll start to be talking about him as, hey, he could be the next big contract player on the defensive side for the Denver Broncos there. And I would love to see just development from the depth overall, right? I mean, Jacob Martin, he's coming back this year. You got Jonathan Cooper. You got Aaron Patrick, hopefully coming back healthy off the injury. Christopher Allen, remember we were all excited about him coming out of last year's draft, getting him as an undrafted player. He's kind of another dart throw that you have this offseason. So there's a lot of names off the edge that Michael Wilhoit, Vance Joseph, they're going to be able to work with. The question is, can you maximize that talent? We've seen, Vance Joseph, he got a lot out of Bradley Chubb and Von Miller, right? He got a lot out of Chandler Jones. He even had, I know that Hassan Reddick didn't necessarily play the exact role that maybe he should have on a full-time basis in Arizona, but he still had a lot of sacks for Vance Joseph. You see this pattern here of guys that are racking up double-digit sacks under Vance Joseph and his defense. Hopefully that aggressiveness will translate for these edge guys. Hopefully they're able to take that next step as players in their development under these guys. It's going to be huge for the Broncos because, like we mentioned, Sean Payton, he wants to be able to trust Vance Joseph on that side of the ball, trust this coaching staff to keep the defense at a high level of play. We'll see what these guys can do.
The only positions we do not know of yet for the Broncos, and whether or not they're even going to add them, assistant defensive back coach and assistant defensive line coach. We have no idea who that's going to be. When you have a multitude of guys to work with, you obviously need another coach to help out. And when you're working, like Christian Parker is an enthusiast in cornerback and safety. Like he's very good at that. But, sometimes you have to split off into groups. That's what the Broncos have done. I don't know if it's going to change under Sean Payton, but those are 2 coaching positions that we have not yet heard about. We'll find out here shortly about who Sean Payton's entire staff will be. There's several positions, a few down to go still before we find out who the 2023 Broncos coaching staff will officially be going forward into next season. Broncos country, let us know your thoughts on this episode down below on YouTube if you're watching, or if you're listening on your favorite audio podcasting platform. Share us your thoughts on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. We'll continue to talk about some of the Broncos offensive coaching moves as well, including Joe Lombardi coming over on staff. The Walton Penner family ownership group taking a long look at the health and safety of players as well as it relates to health and player performance. We dive into that on tomorrow's episode, Locked On Broncos, as the team and their brass are at Indianapolis this week for the NFL Scouting Combine.